hit the convoy at 0347 hours, and the valley became a kill box in under 9 seconds. Sergeant First Class Nathan Briggs was screaming into the radio when the second round landed 40 meters closer, showering the overturned Humvee with rock fragments and a fine mist of pulverized earth that coated his teeth and the inside of his throat. He spat, wiped his face with a glove that was already dark with someone else's blood, and pressed himself deeper into the ditch. 12 men from Operational Detachment Alpha 3124 were pinned in a drainage channel that ran along the eastern floor of the Gamber Valley, and the channel was not deep enough. It was not deep enough by about 2 feet. Every man knew it. Nobody said it. The incoming fire was coming from 3 elevations and at least 4 separate positions, which meant the ambush had been planned by someone who understood geometry and patience in equal measure, and that combination was the one that killed Americans. Colonel Elias Varga, who had not worn a uniform in 14 months and whose knees had not been designed for this altitude, pressed his back against a boulder that was large enough to stop a rifle round, but not a mortar, and counted the muzzle flashes on the northern ridge. He counted 11. Then he counted again and got 14. The discrepancy meant they were moving, which meant they were organized, which meant this was not the tribal militia that the intelligence brief had described. This was something rehearsed. He pulled a laminated map from his vest pocket, unfolded it with hands that were steady only because it taught them to be steady across 22 years and 6 wars, and traced the terrain contours with his thumb. The valley narrowed 400 meters to the west. If the fighters on the northern ridge pushed down to that choke point before the team could move, the geometry went from bad to terminal. Briggs crawled to Varga's position and shouted over the gunfire, "Sir, Warhorse 6 says air support is 47 minutes out." 47 minutes. He said the number twice because it was the kind of number that needed to be heard twice to be believed. Sergeant Chin is hit. Gutierrez has a tourniquet on his own leg, and he's still returning fire. But we're burning through 5.56, and we don't have 47 minutes worth of anything. Varga did not respond immediately. He was looking up past the muzzle flashes, past the northern ridgeline, to a position 1,400 meters above the valley floor, where a single figure lay motionless against the granite in a ghillie suit that was indistinguishable from the rock face. He had placed her there 9 hours earlier when the world was still quiet, and the mission was still a reconnaissance element and not a massacre. He had placed her there because he believed what her file said, and more importantly, he believed what her file did not say. He keyed the radio to a channel that only 2 people on this mountain could hear. "Ren, this is Varga. How copy?" The response came back 3 seconds later, unhurried, as though the woman on the ridge were sitting in a library rather than lying prone on frozen stone at 2,800 meters with 31 armed fighters below her and the wind tearing across the face at 19 knots. Ren copies. "I count 31 shooters from up here. 3 PKM positions, 2 RPG teams, and what looks like a command element near the stone building at grid reference 479er. I have a firing solution on 26 of them. The other 5 are behind hard cover. They'll move eventually." Varga closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, Briggs was staring at him. "Who is that?" Briggs asked. "That," Varga said, "is the reason we're not dead yet." He did not know it then, but he was exactly right. And the woman on the ridge, Corporal Sarah Falcone, who had been still for so long that frost had formed on the fabric covering her trigger hand, was already doing the math that would keep 12 men alive. She had been doing math like this since she was 5 years old. The difference was that today, the numbers were people, and every answer she got wrong would subtract 1 from the count of men who went home. The fighters in the valley had made a mistake. They had planned for the team below. They had not planned for the woman above. And that mistake, born from the same arrogance that had dismissed her at every stage of her career, was about to cost them everything. Before we go any further, if stories like this move you, if you believe that real courage deserves to be told, please subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end and drop a comment below with the city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. 6 weeks earlier, Kira Falcone arrived at Camp Merrill in the North Georgia mountains with a duffel bag that weighed exactly 31 pounds and a service record that read like a redacted novel. The pages that weren't blacked out showed a corporal with 4 years in the Marine Corps, a primary MOS in intelligence analysis, and a secondary qualification in precision marksmanship that had been annotated twice by officers who apparently could not believe what they were signing. The pages that were blacked out, which constituted roughly 40% of her file, told a different story entirely. But nobody at Camp Merrill was cleared to read that story, and Kira had no intention of telling it. She stepped off the transport at 0614 hours on a Monday morning in October, and the first thing she noticed was not the facility or the mountains or the other candidates assembling near the main building. The first thing she noticed was the wind. It was coming from the northwest at approximately 7 knots, but there was a secondary current rolling down from a ridge to the east that created a crosswind shear about 3 meters above ground level. She could see it in the way the pine branches moved differently at their tips than at their bases. She had been reading wind since before she could read words, and this wind was telling her that the valley they were standing in would funnel and accelerate anything coming from the north by the time it reached the firing positions she could see laid out on the southern slope. The range flags, which were standard issue and position at shooter height, would show a wind that was 2 to 3 knots different from what the bullet would actually encounter at its apex. Anyone who trusted the flags would miss. She filed this information away the way other people filed away the location of the nearest coffee shop, automatically and without effort. The Joint Special Operations Sniper Selection was not technically open to women. What it was technically was gender-neutral by directive, which meant that a memorandum had been signed at the Pentagon 7 months earlier ordering the program to evaluate candidates based solely on qualification scores, and the memorandum had been received at Camp Merrill with the enthusiasm typically reserved for audit notifications and dental appointments. Kira was not the first woman to attempt the program. She was the first woman to arrive with scores high enough that no procedural objection could be sustained. Her qualification round at Quantico had produced a grouping at 600 meters that the range master had photographed and sent to 3 different people, none of whom had asked for it. All 3 had called back within the hour. There were 19 other candidates. Kira knew some of them by reputation, which in the special operations community meant she knew their shooting records and their deployment histories and almost nothing about their personalities. She recognized Nathan Briggs from a marksmanship competition at Fort Moore the previous spring, where he had finished first, and she had finished second by 4 points, and where he had accepted his trophy without once looking in her direction, which she found more informative than any conversation would have been. Briggs was tall, with the kind of lean musculature that endurance athletes develop, and he carried himself with the specific confidence of a man who had been the best shooter in every room he had ever entered. He was 29, a sergeant first class in the 75th Ranger Regiment, and he had 7 confirmed kills across 3 deployments, each one documented in the clean, clinical language of after-action reports that reduced the act of ending a human life to grid coordinates and time stamps. Briggs noticed the way a territorial animal notices an unfamiliar scent. He did not speak to her that first morning. He spoke about her, loudly enough that she could hear, to a cluster of 4 other candidates who were stretching near the equipment cage. "Command is running a social experiment," he said, and the word experiment carried the particular way of a man who believed he was stating an obvious truth. "We're going to spend 6 weeks babysitting a quota hire, so some general can check a box on a briefing slide." Outstanding. The 4 men around him produced sounds that were not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, the non-committal noises of people who were calculating which response would cost them the least. Kira was 12 meters away, checking the 0 on her scope. She heard every word. Her hands did not change speed or pressure. Her breathing did not alter. She adjusted the windage turret by 1/4 minute of angle, which was a correction required for the wind she had read upon arrival, and she logged the adjustment in a small notebook she kept in her left chest pocket. The notebook was olive drab, water-resistant, and contained 7 years of wind data, handwritten, from every range and every field position she had ever occupied. The first entry on the first page was in handwriting that was not hers. That handwriting belonged to her father, Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Falcone, who had made the first entry when Kira was 5 years old, and the rifle was a bolt-action .22 that was longer than she was tall. The entry read, October 14th. Wind from east for not steady. Kira fired 20 rounds at tin can, 30 yards. Hit 0. She wants to go again tomorrow. Good. The next day's entry, also in his handwriting, read, "Hit 0. She did not cry. Better." The entries continued daily for the next 3 months, and on the 91st day, the entry read, "Hit 1. She put the rifle down and walked inside and ate dinner without saying a word about it. Best." Thomas Falcone had been a Force Recon Marine, 2 combat tours in Iraq, a man whose official biography listed him as a recipient of the Navy Cross, and whose unofficial biography, the one told in quiet rooms at Camp Lejeune by men who had served alongside him, described someone who could read terrain the way a conductor reads sheet music, hearing not just the notes but the spaces between them. He had trained Kira not because he wanted a daughter who could shoot, but because he recognized in her, before she could recognize it in herself, a stillness that most people never develop and that cannot be taught. It can only be identified and then protected from the noise that would otherwise destroy it. He spent 12 years protecting that stillness. He built around it a technical framework of ballistics and meteorology and anatomy and patience that turned an unusual temperament into an extraordinary capability. And then, on a night in Fallujah in 2015, when Kira was 17, he went out on a mission from which he did not return. The official report said ambush. The official report said that his team's position had been compromised by hostile signals intelligence. The official report was 11 pages long and classified at a level that Kira at 17 could not access. What she knew, because a master sergeant named Dominguez had come to their house in Oceanside, California, and had sat in the kitchen and had looked at her mother with an expression that contained more information than his words did, was that her father had died doing something that mattered, in a place that would never be named publicly, and that the details were under review. The review had never concluded. The details had never been released. And Kira, who had inherited her father's ability to read what was not being said as clearly as what was, understood that under review meant someone did not want the truth to arrive at its destination. That understanding had shaped every decision she had made since. She did not join the Marine Corps to honor her father. She joined because the Marine Corps was the institution that possessed the classified files she needed to read. And the only path to those files ran through a career distinguished enough to earn the clearances that guarded them. Everything she had done in 4 years, every qualification, every school, every volunteer deployment, was a step toward a room she had not yet entered, where a file she had not yet read would tell her whether her father had been killed by the enemy or by something worse. Nobody at Camp Merrill knew any of this. What they saw was a female corporal, 5'7", 138 pounds, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that were the color of creek water in November, a kind of gray-green that shifted depending on the light, and revealed very little regardless of its shade. What they saw was a woman who did not speak unless spoken to, who arrived at the range before dawn and left after dark, and who moved the facility with the careful, observant quiet of someone cataloging exits. The first formal evaluation was a cold bore precision test at 500 meters. Standard conditions, mild crosswind, paper targets. The candidates fired in pairs, and Kira was paired with a staff sergeant from the 82nd Airborne named Luis Padilla, who nodded to her without warmth or hostility and settled behind his rifle with the businesslike efficiency of a man who had done this several thousand times. Kira took her position, built her natural point of aim, and began the breathing sequence her father had taught her when she was 9. 4 counts in, 7 count hold, 8 counts out, not a combat breathing technique. He had told her, a living technique. The body is always telling you what it wants to do. Your job is to listen and then to choose. She fired 5 rounds in 44 seconds. All 5 hit within a circle that could be covered by a $50 coin. The range master, a chief warrant officer named Beckwith who had been running this evaluation for 11 years, walked to the target, looked at it, walked back, looked at her, and then walked to the target again. He wrote something on his clipboard. Kira did not ask what it was. Padilla, who had placed 4-5 in the center ring, and was accustomed to that being an excellent score, glanced at her target, and then looked away with particular expression of a man recalculating his assumptions. Briggs fired in the next pair. His grouping was tight, professional, well within the performance standard. He walked past Kira's lane without stopping, but his eyes moved to her target and stayed there for approximately 2 seconds, which was long enough. That evening, In the common area where candidates cleaned weapons and pretended not to evaluate one another, Briggs sat across from her for the first time. "Falcone," he said. "Briggs," she said. "4 years as an intel analyst, and you shoot like that." It was not a question, but it demanded an answer. "I shoot like that because I've been shooting since before I could tie my shoes." She said it without looking up from the bolt she was cleaning. "The intel MOS was my choice. The shooting was my father's. Your father being Thomas Falcone, Force Recon, the one who died in Fallujah." He said it the way people sometimes handle classified information in unclassified settings, with a tone that acknowledged he was not supposed to know this, but wanted her to understand that he did. "Yes. So this is a legacy thing. Daddy's little girl wants to finish what Daddy started." The room, which contained 6 other candidates in various stages of weapon maintenance, became very quiet. Not the quiet of people who had stopped talking, but the quiet of people who had stopped breathing. Kira set down the bolt. She set down the cleaning cloth. She placed both hands flat on the table, and she looked at Briggs with an expression that contained no anger and no hurt and no defiance. It contained something much worse than any of those things. It contained clarity. "Briggs, what was your elevation correction on the 4th round today? The one that drifted 11 centimeters right of your group." He blinked. The drift had been 8 centimeters, not 11. But he did not know that she knew his exact grouping, and the confidence of her specificity introduced a small crack in his certainty. "You didn't correct for the thermal updraft that starts building off the south-facing rock at about 0940 when the sun hits it," she continued. "It adds a lateral push of about 1/2 to 3/4 of a minute at that distance. I adjusted for it on my 2nd round. You could see it in the mirage lines if you watched the spotting scope for about 90 seconds before firing, which I did." She picked up the bolt again. "So, if you're going to evaluate whether I belong here, maybe start by figuring out why you missed something I caught before breakfast." She resumed cleaning. Briggs sat for a moment in a silence that had become a very specific kind of uncomfortable, the kind that exists when a person realizes they have been publicly corrected and cannot dispute the correction. He stood up, collected his weapon components, and left. He did not slam the door. He closed it with control that was more revealing than anger would have been. Staff Sergeant Delgado, who had been oiling a barrel at the far end of the table and who had not spoken during the exchange, waited until Briggs was gone. Then she said quietly, "That thermal updraft. You're right about it. I've been shooting this range for 3 rotations, and I never isolated it." Kira looked at her. Delgado was 34, a Green Beret weapons sergeant with 2 bronze stars and a face that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts that did not quite match, a slightly crooked nose, one ear that sat higher than the other, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She was the only other woman in the selection course, though she had entered the Special Forces pipeline rather than as a direct marksmanship candidate, and she carried herself with the settled confidence of someone who had stopped caring about what people thought her approximately 1 war ago. "It's consistent," Kira said. "Every south-facing rock face in these mountains does the same thing between 0900 and 1100. My father used to call them ghost hands. You can't see them, but they're pushing." "Ghost hands," Delgado repeated. "That's not in any manual I've read. It's in his notebook." Kira tapped her chest pocket. "He filled 3 of these before he died. Wind patterns, thermal behaviors, mirage charts for 67 different terrain profiles. He didn't write them for publication. He wrote them for me." Delgado nodded slowly, the way a person nods when they are not agreeing, but understanding. "Keep your head down, Falcone. Briggs is going to come at you harder after tonight. Men like him don't get quieter when they're embarrassed. They get louder." "I know," Kira said. "I've been around men like him my whole life." Delgado's prediction proved accurate within 48 hours. On the morning of the 3rd day, Kira arrived at her assigned equipment locker to find that her drag bag had been moved to a different bay and her scope caps had been reversed, a petty piece of sabotage that would not damage anything, but would cost her 4 minutes of reorganization before the day's first drill. For minutes that, in a program where evaluation points were awarded partly on preparation speed, could mean the difference between a pass and a marginal. She corrected the issue without comment, and she did not report it, because reporting would confirm to Briggs that it had affected her, and the absence of reaction was a more damaging response than any complaint. On the 5th day, a formal objection letter appeared on the desk of Colonel Varga, who had arrived 2 days earlier as the external evaluator assigned by Joint Special Operations Command. The letter bore 8 signatures, Briggs's at the top, and it requested Morrison's removal from the program on grounds of integrated operational risk to unit effectiveness. The language was careful, bureaucratic, and precisely vague enough to sound like a professional concern rather than what it was. Varga read it twice, set it on his desk, and spent the next 3 hours reviewing every evaluation metric for every candidate in the course. He then drafted a 14-page response that addressed each of the letter's claims with specific data points, including range scores, physical fitness evaluations, tactical assessment grades, and peer interaction records. His response did not mention gender. It did not need to. The data was sufficient, and Varga, who had spent 22 years in Delta Force learning to let evidence speak, preferred sufficiency to rhetoric. He also did something he did not tell Kira about. He pulled her classified file, the one that was 40% redacted for everyone else, but fully accessible to a man with his clearance level. He read it in his quarters that evening with the door locked and a glass of bourbon he did not touch. When he finished reading, he sat for a long time looking at the wall. Then he picked up a pen and wrote in the margin of his evaluation notebook a single word: generational. He underlined it. Then he underlined it again. What the classified file contained was this: Corporal Kira Falcone had, 18 months prior, been attached to a joint intelligence task force operating in a country that the Department of Defense did not publicly acknowledge having personnel in. During that attachment, she had provided precision fire support for an extraction operation that had gone wrong in ways that were still being investigated. The details were redacted. The outcome was not. 9 people had been extracted alive from a situation that 3 separate after-action reviews had described as non-survivable. The commendation she had received for this action was itself classified, which meant it existed in a file that benefited her career not at all, a decoration that could not be worn, for an operation that could not be discussed, in a country that could not be named. She had returned from that deployment and resumed her duties as an intelligence analyst without requesting recognition, without filing for benefits related to the engagement, and without telling anyone what happened. The only indication that anything unusual had occurred was a single entry in her medical record noting treatment for mild frostbite on 3 fingers of her left hand, the hand that held the rifles for end. Varga understood what he was looking at. He had seen exactly 2 shooters in his career who possessed whatever was that Kira possessed, that intersection of physical control and psychological architecture that allowed a human being to perform precise technical work, while the world was actively trying to kill them. One of those shooters had been a man named Thomas Falcone, whom Varga had met once briefly at a joint training exercise in 2008. Thomas had fired 3 rounds at a moving target at 700 meters and placed all 3 within a space that Varga could have covered with his thumb. They had spoken for perhaps 10 minutes afterward about wind and patience, and the things you learn about yourself when you are very alone and very far from help. Varga remembered the conversation because Thomas Falcone was one of those rare people who said less than he knew, and because the things he did say had the density of compressed experience, as though each sentence had been refined over years until only the essential words remained. Now he was looking at Thomas's daughter's file, and the word he had written, generational, was not hyperbole. It was taxonomy. The crucible evaluation came on the 12th day. 72 hours of continuous tactical scenarios with scheduled sleep deprivation, environmental stress, and escalating difficulty. The final assessment was a precision engagement at 900 meters after 20 hours without sleep, in rain, with a crosswind that the evaluators had specifically chosen this date to exploit. 3 rounds, 3 targets. Passing required 2 hits in the scoring zone. Kira fired 3 rounds, 3 targets, 3 center hits. Her grouping was tighter than it had been on the first day's cold bore test in perfect conditions, which was not supposed to be possible after 20 hours of exhaustion, and which the range master, Chief Warrant Officer Beckwith, noted in his log with the abbreviation NFE, which stood for no further explanation, and which was his private shorthand for things he had seen but could not account for. 13 of the original 20 candidates remained after the crucible. Briggs was among them, having performed well but not exceptionally, carrying a cumulative score that placed him third. Kira was first. The margin was not close. It was during the Crucible's recovery period that Kira found herself alone in the equipment shed at 0430, performing the ritual her father had taught her, field stripping her rifle completely, cleaning every component, reassembling it, and then verifying zero on a reference point before anyone else was awake. She was on the reassembly when Varga appeared in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee, one of which he set on the bench beside her without asking whether she wanted it. "You shoot like your father," he said. Her hands paused for less than a second. "You knew him?" "Once. Briefly. Joint exercise at 29 Palms in 2008. He put 3 rounds through a space the size of a bottle cap at 700 meters on a moving target. And then he talked to me about wind for 10 minutes like he was describing something beautiful." Varga sat on a crate that was not designed for sitting, but accepted his weight without complaint. "I've been evaluating shooters for 12 years. Falcone. I've seen talent. I've seen training. I've seen the combination of both that produces what the community calls a top-tier operator. What I saw on that range today, after 20 hours of no sleep, is something I don't have a word for. Or I have one word for it, but it sounds like exaggeration. What's the word? Generational." She finished the reassembly, performed a function check, and set the rifle down. Then she picked up the coffee. "My father used to say that the rifle doesn't know who's holding it. It only knows physics. Wind speed, air density, elevation, rotation, gravity. The human being is just a delivery system. If the delivery system is calm, the physics works. If the delivery system is panicking, the physics still works, but the inputs are wrong." She took a sip. "He spent 12 years making sure my inputs would be right even when everything else was wrong." The letter from Briggs and his friends. Varga said, "You know about it. I know that 8 people signed something. I know it went to your desk. I know you have removed me," which means either the letter didn't say what they think it said, or you read something that outweighed it. Both, actually. He looked at her with an expression she had seen before on the face of Master Sergeant Dominguez in her mother's kitchen. The expression of a man deciding how much truth a person could hold. "I read your full file. Falcone, the unredacted version." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not surprise, because she had assumed that an evaluator of his clearance level would have access, but something closer to a recalibration. The classified file was a door that, once opened, changed the shape of every conversation that followed. She waited. "I'm not going to discuss the contents," Varga said. "I'm going to say one thing, and then we're going to finish our coffee and never have this conversation again. The thing is this. You are not here to prove yourself. You proved yourself 18 months ago in a place that doesn't have a name on any map I can show you. You are here because the program needs to know what you can do when conditions are controlled and the documentation is clean. That's for the institution, not for you. For you, I suspect you're here because this program gets you one step closer to a clearance that opens a specific door. Am I wrong?" She held his gaze. "No, sir, you're not wrong." "Then do what you came to do. Shoot well, graduate, get the clearance, open the door, and when you find what's behind it, come talk to me, because I have a feeling that what happened to your father is connected to something larger than one mission in Fallujah, and there are people in this building right now who would prefer that connection never be made." He stood, took his coffee, and left. Kira sat alone in the equipment shed as the first gray light began to leak through the windows, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not hope. Hope was too fragile and too easily disappointed. What she felt was alignment, the sensation of multiple vectors converging toward a single point: her father's training, her own career, the classified file, the program, the clearance, the door. For the first time, the geometry of her life made a shape she could recognize, and the shape pointed forward. 2 weeks later, the selection course concluded. Kira Falcone graduated first in the class. Briggs graduated fourth. The graduation was a brief ceremony attended by a small number of senior officers who did not smile and did not take photographs, and who left in vehicles with no visible markings within 20 minutes of the final handshake. Kira received her qualification, her orders, and a deployment notification that was hand-delivered rather than electronically transmitted, which in the special operations community meant the mission was sensitive enough that its existence would not appear on any server that could be audited. The deployment was to Kunar Province, Afghanistan. The mission was classified. The target was a man named Farid Khalil Zardan. Farid Khalil Zardan was 43 years old, a former mathematics teacher from Khost who had joined the Haqqani network in 2009 and had, over the course of 14 years, evolved from a logistics courier into the single most effective operational planner the network had ever produced. He was not a fighter. He had never, as far as intelligence could determine, personally fired a weapon at another human being. What he did was worse. He designed attacks the way an architect designs buildings, with attention to load-bearing structures and sight lines and the relationship between spaces. The Jalalabad market bombing that killed 47 civilians, including 11 children, had been his design. The Asadabad convoy ambush that killed 6 American soldiers and 2 Afghan interpreters had been his design. The Meterlam police station siege had been his design. Each attack bore his signature. Multiple simultaneous axes of assault, exploitation of terrain features that coalition forces had mapped but not fully understood, and a withdrawal plan that ensured his fighters survived to be reused. He treated human beings as components, arranging them in configurations optimized for maximum damage, and he did this with the calm proficiency of a man solving an equation. Coalition intelligence had been tracking Zardan for 3 years without successfully fixing his location for longer than 6 hours. He moved constantly, slept in a different village each night, and communicated through a system of human couriers that left no electronic signature. The one constant in his pattern was a monthly meeting at a compound in the Upper Gambar Valley, a narrow, steep-sided canyon in the mountains southeast of Asadabad, where the terrain was so hostile to aerial surveillance that the compound had never been successfully imaged from above. The compound belonged to a tribal elder named Haji Suleiman, who publicly condemned the Haqqani network and privately provided them with shelter, food, and the use of a satellite phone that was registered in the name of a dead man. The intelligence package that arrived at the forward operating base at Asadabad was 31 pages long and had been compiled by Major Leland Croft, the intelligence liaison attached to the Joint Special Operations Task Force. Croft was 38, a West Point graduate with a master's degree in strategic communications from Georgetown and a career trajectory that had been described by his superiors as accelerated and by his peers as frictionless, which in both cases was a polite way of saying that Croft had advanced faster than his experience warranted and had done so by being exceptionally good at telling powerful people what they wanted to hear. He was lean, polished, articulate, and possessed the kind of unearned confidence that, in the military, is sometimes mistaken for competence until the moment it is tested. Croft's intelligence package described the Gambar Valley compound as lightly defended, with an estimated security element of 8 to 12 fighters, locally recruited, poorly armed, and operated without coordination with the larger Haqqani network. The package assessed the terrain as manageable and the exfiltration routes as multiple and viable. It recommended a 12-man ODA insertion with a 72-hour reconnaissance phase, followed by a direct action strike time to Zardan's next scheduled meeting. Colonel Varga read the package on a Tuesday evening in a plywood-walled office that smelled like diesel and dust. He read it once for content. He read it a second time for what was missing. Then he read it a third time for what was wrong. What was missing was satellite imagery of the valley's northern ridge, which should have been included in any terrain analysis of a canyon environment. What was wrong was a force estimate. Varga had spent enough time in these mountains to know that a compound used by a Haqqani operational planner of Zardan's importance would not be protected by 8 to 12 local recruits. It would be protected by a force large enough to delay a coalition response until the principal could escape, and in a valley with a Gambier geometry, that meant a force position on the high ground, which was a northern ridge, which was the one piece of terrain that Croft's package did not address. He brought his concerns to Croft in a meeting that lasted 11 minutes. Croft listened with the patient, faintly condescending attention of a man who believed he was being questioned by someone who did not understand the intelligence process. Colonel, the northern ridge has been assessed by signals and imagery analysis. There's no indication of in-place positions or routine patrol activity. The locals use the ridge for goat grazing. It's a non-factor. Who assessed it? Varga asked. My team. The assessment is in the appendix. Varga had read the appendix. The assessment of the northern ridge consisted of 2 sentences and a single SIGINT intercept that was 11 days old. Major, I've operated in terrain like this for 20 years. Valleys like the Gamber are natural kill boxes. Any competent defender places his strength on the high ground and lets the terrain do the compression. If Zardan is as capable as his file suggests, the ridge is not a non-factor. The ridge is the entire factor. Croft smiled. It was the kind of smile that officers produce when they wish to communicate that a conversation is over without explicitly saying so. I appreciate the tactical perspective, Colonel. I'll note your concerns in the supplemental, but the mission is approved at division level, and the timeline doesn't support additional reconnaissance of terrain that has already been cleared. Varga left the meeting with a distinct and familiar feeling of a man who has just been listened to and not heard. He returned to his quarters, opened the intelligence package again, and stared at the gap where the Northern Ridge assessment should have been. Then he picked up secure phone and made 3 calls. The first call was to the imagery analyst Epigram, who told him that satellite passes over the Gamber Valley had been reprioritized 3 weeks earlier on Croft's request, redirecting coverage to a different sector. The second call was to a SIGINT officer he trusted, who told him off the record that there had been intercepts suggesting organized activity on the Gamber ridgelines, but that these intercepts had been classified as unconfirmed and routed to a holding file that Croft controlled. The third call was to the task force commander, Brigadier General Marcusfeld, who listened to Varga's concerns, asked 3 precise questions, and then said, Leland Croft was handpicked by people above me, Elias. I can't delay an approved mission on the basis of what you think might be on a ridge. Give me evidence, and I'll act. Until then, the timeline holds. Varga hung up and sat in silence for a long time. Then he went to find Kira Falcone. He found her at the range, which was where she always was when she was not sleeping or eating, and sometimes when she should have been doing both. It was 2,130 hours, and she was firing at paper targets at 400 meters by moonlight, a practice exercise her father had called blind math, in which the shooter calculates a hold based entirely on known variables, distance, wind, elevation, temperature, without visual confirmation of the reticle, and trusts the solution. The targets, when retrieved, would reveal whether the math was right. Kira's targets, in the 7 sessions she had conducted since arriving in country, had been right every time. Falcone, Varga said, standing behind her and to the right, outside her peripheral vision, but within the zone where his voice would carry without startling her. She fired, cycled the bolt, did not turn. Colonel, I need to brief you on something that isn't in the official package. Now she turned, in the blue-white moonlight. Her face had the quality of a photograph, all contrast and no softness. The Northern Ridge. Varga paused. How did you know? Because I read the intelligence package, and the Northern Ridge isn't in it. In a valley with that geometry. The only reason you leave the high ground out of your assessment is if you don't know it's important, which would make you incompetent, or if you know it's important and you want people to ignore it, which would make you something else. Varga felt the hair on his forearms lift, not from cold, but from a recognition that he was speaking to someone who processed information the same way he did, by identifying what was absent rather than what was present. The mission is in 72 hours. I can't delay it. I can't add reconnaissance assets. What I can do is put a shooter on that ridge before the ODA goes into the valley, someone who can see what Cross Intelligence refuses to see, and who can provide overwatch if the force estimate turns out to be catastrophically wrong. You want me on the ridge? I want you on the ridge. Alone. I'll be with the ODA in the valley. Delgado is on the assault element. There is no second sniper qualified for altitude work in this AO. So yes, alone. She was quiet for 11 seconds. Varga counted. In his experience, the length of silence before a decision correlated directly with the seriousness with which the decision was being made, and 11 seconds was very serious indeed. What's my ammunition allocation? She asked. 48 rounds of .300 Winchester Magnum. Standard match load, plus your sidearm with 3 magazines. And if there are more than 48 problems on that ridge, then we are all in significant trouble, and you will need to be creative. Something that was not quite a smile moved across her face. My father used to say that creativity is what happens when preparation meets a situation that nobody prepared for. Your father was a wise man. My father was a dead man, Colonel. Wise men don't die in ambushes that their own intelligence should have prevented. She held his gaze. I'll take the ridge. But I want to see the raw SIGINT intercepts from the last 30 days. Not Croft summaries. The raw takes. Varga nodded. I'll have them to you by morning. And, Colonel, if Croft's force estimate is wrong, it won't be wrong by a little. Planners like Zardin don't think in small numbers. If the ridge is defended, it's defended in depth, which means the valley isn't a reconnaissance target. It's a trap. Varga did not answer. He did not need to. They both knew she was right. The raw SIGINT intercepts arrived at 0515 the next morning in a sealed envelope that bore no classification markings, which meant Varga had obtained them through channels that would not survive official scrutiny. Kira read them in her quarters, a plywood cubicle barely large enough for a cot and a footlocker, with the door propped open because the ventilation was designed for a climate 20 degrees cooler. There were 14 intercepts spanning 26 days, and they painted a picture that was radically different from the one in Croft intelligence package. The intercepts described organized movement on both the northern and southern ridgelines of the Gamber Valley. They referenced positions being prepared and supplies being moved forward. One intercept, dated 9 days prior, contained a fragment that made Kira's breathing change for the first time since she had arrived in country, a reference to the American woman who shoots in the phrase, she must be considered. Someone in the Haqqani network knew about her. Someone had briefed the fighters in the Gamber Valley that a female sniper might be part of the coalition response. This was not local intelligence. This was sourced from inside the task force. She read the intercept 3 times. Then she set the papers down, placed her palms on her knees, and performed the exercise her father had taught her for moments when the mind needed to be reset. Close the eyes, breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 7, exhale for 8, and then open the eyes and look at the problem as though seeing it for the first time. The exercise took 15 seconds. When she opened her eyes, the problem had not changed, but her relationship to it had. She was no longer surprised. She was oriented. Someone inside the task force was feeding information to the Haqqani network. The intelligence package had been deliberately constructed to conceal the strength of the Gamber Valley defenses. The satellite coverage had been redirected to prevent updated imagery from contradicting the false assessment, and her identity, her capability, and possibly her deployment had been communicated to the enemy. The geometry was clear. Croft had built a box, and the Odia was about to walk into it, and she was supposed to be on the ridge where the enemy already expected her. She could report this. She could take the intercepts to Varga, who would take them to General Feld, who would delay the mission and launch an investigation that would take weeks and result in the target escaping and the mole going deeper into cover. Or she could do what her father would have done, which was to take the information, adjust the variables, and solve the equation herself. She chose the latter, not out of recklessness, not out of arrogance, out of the same calculus that had governed every decision of her adult life. The calculation of which action would preserve the most lives and produce the most truth in the smallest window of time. She would go to the ridge. She would not go to the position that Varga had designated, because that position was the one the enemy would be watching. She would find a different position, one that gave her sight lines on the valley and on the ridge. Because if the enemy was on the ridge in force, she would need to engage them from an angle they were not expecting. And she would watch, carefully, the flow of information from the task force of the field, because somewhere in that flow was a thread that, if pulled, would unravel a network that might lead all the way back to a night in Fallujah in 2015 when a force recon Marine named Thomas Falcone went out on a mission that someone had made sure he would not survive. She packed her kit at 1900 hours. 48 rounds of .300 Win Mag in a bandolier she had sewn herself, each round seated in an individual elastic loop to prevent noise. Her M40A6 rifle, cleaned and zeroed, with the Schmidt and Bender scope her father had bought with his own money and which he had carried through every deployment since his death. A Beretta M9 with 3 magazines, 2 liters of water, a single MR, a thermal blanket the size of a paperback book, her father's Win notebook, and a small laminated photograph, creased at the corners from years of being held, that showed a man in desert camouflage kneeling beside a girl of about 8, both of them looking not at the camera, but at something in the distance, a target neither of them had yet hit, but both of them intended to. The helicopter inserted her on the eastern slope of the Gamber Valley at 0200 hours, 3 kilometers from the designated overwatch position, an altitude of 2,600 meters. The pilot, a warrant officer named Renko who had flown insertions into valleys like this for 4 years and who had strong opinions about the wisdom of dropping a single operator into hostile terrain in the dark, said nothing during the flight except good luck as she stepped onto the skid, which was more than most pilots said, and less than he wanted to. She moved through darkness that was not truly dark. At altitude, without cloud cover, the stars provided enough ambient light to distinguish terrain features at 20 meters, and Kira moved by starlight and by feel, her boots finding the surfaces of rocks through a sensitivity that was part training and part the animal inheritance of a body that had spent thousands of hours on mountain terrain. She climbed for 90 minutes, bypassing the designated overwatch position by 400 meters to the south, and established herself in a shallow depression behind a granite outcropping that gave her a firing lane to the valley floor, a secondary lane to the northern ridge, and a cover withdrawal route to the east that followed a seasonal stream bed to a saddle below the ridgeline. It was not the perfect position. There was no perfect position, but it was a position that no one would be expecting. And in the mathematics of survival, the unexpected was worth more than the optimal. She settled in at 0347. She was alone on a mountain in eastern Afghanistan in October at 2,800 meters, with 48 rounds and the accumulated knowledge of a dead man's 12 years of patience. The temperature was -4 degrees Celsius. The wind was from the northwest at 11 knots, with gusts to 19. The stars were very clear. She began to wait. The ODA entered the valley at 0530, 12 men moving in 2 6-man elements along the drainage channel that ran the length of the canyon floor. Kira watched them through her scope, tracking their movement with the detached precision of a chess player observing pieces on a board. She identified Varga by his gait, which favored his left knee, and Delgado by the way she carried her weapon slightly forward the standard ready position, a habit of operators who had spent time in confined urban spaces. Briggs was on the lead element's left flank, moving well, his rifle disciplined clean. Whatever Kira thought of his character, she did not question his competence in the field. The two things did not need coexist. The valley was quiet, too quiet, and Kira knew the specific quality of the silence, because her father had described it to her when she was 12, sitting on the back porch of their house in Oceanside, while he cleaned a rifle, and she recorded wind readings from the flagpole at the end of the street. "There's a silence that means nothing is happening," he had said. "And there's a silence that means everything is about to happen. The difference is in the birds. When birds are quiet because it's early, they're quiet in a scattered way, each one silent on its own schedule. When birds are quiet because something is wrong, they're quiet together. That's coordination. That's awareness. That's a silence you should be afraid of." The birds in the Gamber Valley were quiet together. Kira noted the absence of the alpine choughs that should have been moving along the ridgeline at this hour, and the absence of the short-toed eagle she had seen circling above the southern slope during her climb. The wildlife had vacated. That meant human presence, and not the small, quiet presence of the ODA in the valley floor. A larger presence. A presence that had been here long enough to push the ecosystem into retreat. She keyed her radio. Varga, Ren. No wildlife activity on the ridge lines. Repeat, 0 wildlife. Something is up here besides us. Varga's response came back immediately. Copy, Ren. We're seeing the same. Proceeding to objective rally point, she scanned the northern ridge through her scope, moving methodically from west to east, using the 25x magnification to examine every rock formation, every shadow, every variation in the surface that could indicate a concealed position. At first, she saw nothing. The ridge looked like what Croft's intelligence had described. Empty terrain, goat paths, scrub vegetation. Then she noticed the rocks. Not all rocks. Specific rocks. 3 of them, spaced approximately 40 meters apart along the ridgeline, had a slightly different color on their southern faces than on their northern faces. The difference was subtle, less than half a shade, the kind of variation that would be invisible from the valley floor and nearly invisible from the air. but from her position, at an oblique angle to the ridge. The angle of the morning light caught the differential and made it legible. The southern faces were darker because they had been moved. Recently, something or someone had shifted those rocks to create gaps between them, gaps that were exactly wide enough for a rifle barrel and a pair of eyes. Fighting positions, at least 3, concealed behind natural rock formations and invisible to anyone not looking from precisely the angle she had chosen by accident and intuition. She scanned further and found 4 more, then 2 more behind those. She was counting 9 prepared fighting positions on the northern ridge alone, which meant the force estimate of 8 to 12 lightly armed locals was not merely wrong. It was a fabrication. A force that built 9 prepared positions with this level of concealment was not a local militia. It was a trained element supplied and briefed and waiting. She reported quietly. Varga, Ren. I have 9. Repeat 9er. Prepared fighting positions on the northern ridge. These are not pickup fighters. This is deliberate defense in depth. Recommend immediate reassessment. The radio was silent for 4 seconds. Then Varga's voice, lower now, the voice of a man adjusting to information that confirmed his worst suspicion. Copy, Ren. Can you count personnel? Negative. They're in defilade. I can see positions, not people. But 9 positions at 3 to 4 fighters per position puts your threat at 27 to 36. Minimum. Another silence. This one lasted 7 seconds. Ren, we are continuing to the ORP. Mission is still active. Division has been informed, and they are not recalling. I need you to stay on that ridge and give me eyes. If this goes wrong, you are the only thing between us and those positions. Understood. Ren is set. She settled deeper into her position. The temperature had dropped another 2 degrees since she had arrived. She could feel the cold beginning to work on her fingers, a stiffness at the second knuckle that would, if unmanaged, eventually compromise her trigger control. She flexed her hands inside her gloves, alternating between the left and the right, maintaining circulation without generating movement that might be visible. She had 48 rounds. She had 9 identified positions, with more likely to emerge as the light improved. The math was simple and unfavorable. If every position held 3 fighters, she was looking at 27 targets with 48 rounds, which gave her a margin of 21 shots, or roughly 1.7 rounds per engagement. That margin assumed perfect accuracy. No misses, no suppression fire, no secondary targets requiring additional rounds. In combat, no one shot perfectly. The margin was therefore not a margin at all. It was a prayer dressed up as arithmetic. She opened her father's notebook to the section on wind at altitude, a handwritten chart that cross-referenced elevation, temperature, air density, and Coriolis effect for a .300 wind mag at distances from 200 to 1,400 meters. She did not need the chart. She had memorized it years ago, but the act of opening the notebook, of seeing her father's handwriting, produced a specific effect in her nervous system, a settling, a calibration. As though the sight is careful, square letters reminded her body of what it already knew and gave it permission to proceed. The first shot of the engagement came at 0617 hours, and it was not hers. A burst of automatic fire erupted from a northern ridge, directed at the ODA's lead element as it crossed an open stretch of the drainage channel. The burst was followed immediately by 2 RPG rounds, one which struck the lead Humvee and flipped it onto its side, and the other which detonated against the channel wall and sent a column of dirt and fragmented rock into the air. The ambush had begun. Kira's scope was already on the first firing position. She could see the muzzle flash from a Pecan machine gun, cycling through a belt at approximately 650 rounds per minute, and behind the gun, partially visible through the gap between the rocks she had identified, the outline of a man's shoulder and the side of his head. He was wearing a brown paycall cap. He was approximately 780 meters from her position. She performed the calculation in under 2 seconds. Distance, 780 meters. Elevation differential, minus 14 degrees, shooting downhill to the ridge from her higher position. Wind, northwest at 13 knots. But the thermal chimney rising from the valley floor was creating a localized updraft that would push the round high at the midpoint of its flight path. Temperature, minus 6 Celsius. Air density at this altitude reduced the drag coefficient, which meant the round would carry slightly more energy at range but would also be more affected by crosswind. Correction: 2 1/4 minutes right, 1 3/4 minutes low. She exhaled slowly, felt her heartbeat through the stock of the rifle, found the pause between beats, the fraction of a second when the body is most still, and pressed the trigger. The recoil pushed her shoulder back into granite. Through the scope, she watched the vapor trail for the half second it was visible, a thread of disturbed air tracing the ballistic arc. The round struck the PKM gunner in the upper chest, just below the collarbone, and he collapsed forward onto his weapon. The PKM went silent. "One down," she said into the radio. Her voice as flat as a weather report. "Position 1, Northern Ridge." She cycled the bolt. The spent brass ejected and landed on the thermal blanket she had laid to her right, which prevented the brass from clicking on rock and revealing her position through sound. 47 rounds remaining. The second fighter appeared in the same position within 4 seconds, pulling his dead companion off the PKM and attempting to reorient the barrel toward the valley. He was faster than Kira expected, and she had to adjust her aim point as he moved, leading him by approximately 6 centimeters. The correction was instinctive, the product of thousands of hours of tracking drills on moving targets that her father had set up using a system of ropes and pulleys on a ranch in Oceanside, dragging a cardboard silhouette at unpredictable speeds across a hillside, while Kira tracked it from 400 meters and waited for a moment when the target paused, because targets always pause, and the pause was where the shot lived. This target paused. He paused to clear a feed jam on the PKM, and in the 1.5 seconds his hands were occupied and his body was still, Kira fired. The round took him in the throat. He fell backward and did not move. 2 down. Same position. 46 rounds. She was counting aloud now, not for the radio, but for herself. The count was a discipline her father had instilled. Always know your ammunition state. Always know exactly, and always say out loud, because the act of speaking the number makes it real in a way that thinking it does not. From the valley floor, the sound of the engagement was intensifying. She could hear the ODA returning fire, the distinctive bark of M4 carbines mixed with the heavier reports of the M240 machine gun that Sergeant Chen was operating from behind the overturned Humvee. Mortar rounds were still falling, which meant someone on the ridge had a line of communication to a mortar team position further back, probably on the reverse slope of the ridge where she could not see them. She turned her scope to the second fighting position, 60 meters east of the first. 2 fighters were firing AK-47s at the valley, their barrels protruding through the rock gap in tandem. She could see both of them, but the gap was narrow enough that she could only engage one at a time, and the moment she fired, the second one would pull back into cover. She chose the one on the right, because his position was slightly more exposed and because his rate of fire was slower, which suggested he was a more deliberate shooter and therefore more dangerous. Distance, 820 meters. The wind had shifted slightly, dropping to 11 knots, but now carrying a rotational component from the thermal updraft that made the correction more complex. She adjusted. She fired. The round struck the fighter in the side of the head. He dropped instantly. The second fighter, as predicted, pulled back behind the rocks. She waited. The scope stayed on the gap. Her breathing was steady. For counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out. The rhythm is automatic as her heartbeat. 3 down. Position 2. 45 rounds. The second fighter at position 2 made her wait 97 seconds. She counted every one of them. During those 97 seconds, 2 more mortar rounds landed in the valley, one of them close enough to the ODA's secondary position that she heard Varga calling for a casualty report on the tactical net. The response from Sergeant Gutierrez was terse. "Chen is hit again. Leg this time. He's still on the gun." Kira processed this information and set it aside. She could not help Chen from up here. She could only reduce the number of people shooting at him. At the 97 second, the fighter leaned back into the gap to resume firing. He leaned 3 inches too far. Kira put the round through his left eye socket at 820 meters. 4 down. Position 2 clear. 44 rounds. The radio crackled. Varga's voice, strained but controlled. "Ren, we have 3 wounded down here, and we are taking effective fire from at least 4 positions. What's your count?" For eliminated. 9 positions identified. I'm working east to west. Give me time. We don't have time. Do what you can. She was already moving her scope to position 3. 2 fighters, one with an RPG on his shoulder, the other feeding him rockets from a canvas bag. The RPG gunner was a priority. Distance, 870 meters. She calculated, adjusted, and fired in under 4 seconds. The round hit the RPG's launch tube rather than the gunner himself. The tube shattered, and the backblast from the armed rocket detonated against the rock face, killing the gunner and the loader both. 1 round, 2 fighters eliminated by physics and poor positioning. 5 and 6 down. Position 3, 43 rounds. She allowed herself 1 second to note that the detonation at position 3 had drawn attention from the remaining fighters on the ridge. Several of them had stopped firing at the valley and were now scanning the terrain, looking for the source of the shots that were dismantling their line from east to west. They would not find her easily. Her position was 400 meters south of where they expected a coalition sniper to be, on higher ground, behind natural concealment, and her muzzle flash was directed away from their line of sight. But they would find her eventually. They were not stupid. They were organized and experienced, Experienced fighters solve problems through methodology, and the methodology for finding a sniper was well established. Observe the direction of incoming fire, triangulate from the sound delay, and dispatch a team to hunt. She estimated she had 15 to 20 minutes before a hunting team was organized. In 15 minutes, at her current rate of 1 engagement every 90 seconds, including repositioning and recalculation, she could address approximately 10 more targets. That would put her total at 16, which would leave between 11 and 20 fighters still operational on the ridge, depending on how many the unidentified positions held. It was not enough. She increased her rate of fire. Position 4 held 3 fighters behind a rock wall that had been reinforced with sandbags, evidence of preparation that further confirmed this was not a hasty defense. The first fighter was exposed from the waist up and was firing an AK in long, undisciplined bursts that suggested he was providing suppressive fire rather than aimed fire. Distance, 910 meters. She fired. Center mass. He folded. The second fighter dropped behind the wall immediately. The third kept firing. She waited 6 seconds for the third fighter to shift his weight, which brought his shoulder and the side of his torso into view. She fired. The round caught him just below the armpit, and he spun sideways and fell. 7 and 8 down. Position 4, 1 still behind cover. 41 rounds. The fighter behind the wall at position 4 did not reemerge. He was either dead, incapacitated, or smart enough to stay down. Kira could not afford to wait for him. She moved to position 5. Position 5 was problematic. It was located behind a natural rock overhang that shielded the fighters from her angle entirely. She could see muzzle flashes from the gap beneath the overhang, but the gap was less than 8 inches high, not enough for a clean shot at a human body. She would need to change positions to create a new angle, and changing positions meant movement, and movement meant exposure. She pulled back from her scope and assessed the terrain around her. 20 meters to her right, a narrow gully ran downhill toward a cluster of boulders that would give her a line of sight beneath the overhang from a lower angle. The gully was shallow, maybe 18 inches deep, enough to conceal her as she moved on her stomach, but the rocks at the end were exposed to the ridgeline from positions 6 through 9, which she had not yet engaged. Moving to the boulders would put her in the sight lines of fighters she had not yet eliminated. The calculation was simple. Stay here in position 5, continues to fire on the valley. Move to the boulders, and she becomes visible to positions she has not neutralized. The first option cost lives below. The second option risked her own life. She chose the second option because the people below could not choose for themselves, and because the decision to accept risk on behalf of others was a decision her father had made every day of his career, and because she had inherited from him not just his skill, but his willingness to be the one who moved toward the sound of gunfire when every rational impulse demanded retreat. She slid into the gully on her stomach, pulling the rifle alongside her, the barrel pointed forward. The scope caps closed to prevent lens reflection. The gully was filled with loose gravel that dug into her elbows and knees through her clothing, and the cold of stone conducted through her body core, dropping her internal temperature in a way she could feel as a tremor in her hands that had not been there 5 minutes earlier. She reached the boulders in 40 seconds, which was 30 seconds longer than she wanted, and settled behind them with her rifle oriented toward position 5. The new angle was better. She could see beneath the overhang. 2 fighters, prone, firing through the gap. One had a Dragunov sniper rifle, which meant he was their designated marksman, which meant he was the one most likely to identify her new position. She took him first. Distance, 740 meters, shorter than her previous engagements, but the angle was steep, almost 30 degrees downhill, which required a holdover adjustment that compensated for the reduced gravitational drop on an angled trajectory. Her father had a formula for this that he called the rifle's lie, because the scope would tell you to hold high, but gravity only acts on the vertical component of the bullet's path. So holding high on a steep angle means overshooting. The correction was to use the cosine of the angle multiplied by the standard drop value, which at 30 degrees meant holding approximately 87% of what the turrets indicated. She made the adjustment. She fired. The Dragunov marksman's head dropped to the ground. His partner, realizing the overhang no longer protected him, attempted to crawl backward out of position. She tracked his movement, waited for him to clear a rock that was blocking her shot, and fired again. 9 and 10 down. Position 5 clear. 39 rounds. She was breathing harder now. The exertion of the position change, combined with the altitude and the cold, was beginning to extract a cost. She could feel her pulse in her temples, faster than she wanted, and the tremor in her hands had stabilized but not disappeared. She flexed her fingers. The second and third knuckles on her left hand were stiffening, the early stage of cold injury that would, if unmanaged, reduce her grip strength by 40% within an hour. She pressed her left hand against her stomach, using her body heat to warm the joints, and continued scanning with her right hand on the pistol grip. From this new position, she could see positions 6 and 7. Position 6 was another 2-man team, firing AKs at the valley. Position 7 was a 3-man team, and one of them was speaking into a handheld radio, which meant he was a command element. The one coordinating the defense and communicated with the mortar team on the reverse slope. She took the radio operator first. Distance, 950 meters. Wind had increased to 15 knots with gusts that she estimated at 22. The gust pattern was irregular, which was the worst kind, because irregular gusts cannot be timed and must instead be shot between. She watched the wind for 30 seconds, feeling on the left side of her face, reading in the movement of the scrub grass 80 meters downrange, and identified a pattern. Gusts were coming in clusters of 2, separated by 4 to 6 seconds of relative calm. She would fire in the calm. The first calm came. She let it pass because she was not yet settled. The second calm came 4 seconds later. She fired. The radio operator dropped. The radio fell from his hand and tumbled down the rock face, its antenna snapping against the boulder. 11 down. Position 7 command element. 38 rounds. The 2 remaining fighters at position 7 turned in her direction. One of them had binoculars, and he was scanning the terrain systematically, which meant the hunting team she had anticipated was now being organized from position 7. She had minutes, maybe fewer. She fired at the man with the binoculars. The wind gusted at the moment of the shot, pushing the round 8 centimeters left. The round struck the rock next to his head, shattering fragments into his face. He dropped the binoculars and clutched his eyes, blinded but alive. She cycled the bolt and fired again. This time the wind cooperated. The round found him. 12 down. 36 rounds. 1 miss. She spoke the miss aloud because her father had required it. "Count your misses the same as your hits," he had told her, sitting on the porch in Oceanside with a glass of water that he never seemed to drink. A miss isn't failure. It's information. It tells you what the wind did that you didn't predict. If you're too proud to count your misses, you're too proud to learn from them. And if you're too proud to learn, you're already dead. You just haven't stopped moving yet. The third fighter at position 7 attempted to run. He broke from the rocks and sprinted toward a gully that would take him to the reverse slope, where the mortar team was positioned. If he reached the mortar team, they would redirect fire to her position, and mortars did not require precise location. They required a general area, and the general area was enough. She led him by 2 body widths at a full sprint, which at 950 meters and his estimated speed of approximately 6 meters per second meant holding roughly 14 meters ahead of his current position. She fired. The round took him mid-stride. He pitched forward and did not rise. 13 down. Position 7 clear. 35 rounds. The radio came alive. Varga's voice, with gunfire audible behind it. Ren, someone from a ridge just called on an open frequency. They're organizing a sweep team. For fighters, heading south along the ridgeline. They know you're up here. Copy. I see position 6, 8, and 9 still active. That's 6 to 9 fighters on the ridge plus the 4-man sweep team. Total threat, 10 to 13. I have 35 rounds. Can you handle the sweep team and the positions? I can handle the positions or the sweep team, not both simultaneously. The sweep team will reach my area in approximately 12 minutes based on the terrain. Roger. Handle the positions first. Buy us time. We'll try to suppress from down here. Understood. She turned her attention to position 6. 2 fighters, both still firing at the valley, apparently unaware that 7 of their comrades on the ridge were already dead. Distance, 880 meters. She engaged the first with a shot that struck him in the back as he leaned forward to reload. He slumped over his weapon. The second fighter heard the impact, turned, and saw his partner collapse. He did not run. He dropped flat behind the rocks, presenting no target. 14 down. Position 6, 1 in cover. 34 rounds. She could not wait for him. The sweep team was moving. She shifted to position 8. Position 8 was the most heavily fortified position on the ridge. 3 fighters behind stacked sandbags with what appeared to be a DSHK heavy machine gun. The DSHK was a 12.7 millimeters weapon capable of engaging armored vehicles, and its current target was the ODA's secondary position in the valley. If she did not silence it, it would kill everyone behind the overturned Humvee within minutes. Distance of position 8, 1,060 meters. The longest shot she had attempted today. At this distance, the bullet's flight time was approximately 1.4 seconds, during which the wind would push it laterally by an amount that depended on conditions that changed continuously and could not be perfectly predicted. This was a realm where marksmanship became something closer to art, where the shooter's judgment replaced calculation, and the decision to fire was an act of trust in one's own perception. She watched the wind. She watched the mirage lines shimmering above the rocks. She felt the gust pattern on her face and correlated it with the movement of the scrub grass at multiple distances downrange, building a mental model of the wind's behavior at every point along the bullet's path. The wind was doing something unusual. At approximately 600 meters, the valley's thermal chimney created a lateral shear that pushed from right to left, but beyond 800 meters, the ridgeline's own wind shadow created a dead zone where the air was nearly still. This meant the bullet would be pushed left in the middle of its flight and then straightened in the final third, a correction that no Scopes turrets could perfectly model because it required understanding not just the wind speed, but its geography. She thought of her father, not his words this time, but his hands, the way they moved when he was reading wind, slight gestures with his fingers as though he were conducting something invisible. She had asked him once what he was doing, and he had said, "I'm feeling it, not the wind on my skin. The wind in my mind. I'd build a picture of what it's doing between here and there, and then I put the bullet on the path that the picture shows me. The picture is never perfect, but it's closer to truth than any instrument I've ever used." She built the picture. She saw the wind in 3 dimensions, a river of air with currents and eddies, and a dead spot at 800 meters where the ridgeline broke the flow. She calculated the hold. 4.5 minutes right to compensate for the leftward push in the middle third, with a slight leftward return as the round entered the dead zone. Elevation, 8.75 minutes up, adjusted for air density at altitude, temperature, and the cosine of the 15-degree downhill angle. She placed the crosshair where the picture told her. She breathed. For counts in. 7 counts hold. She felt her heartbeat slow, not through conscious effort, but through the same mechanism that had always been present in her, the thing her father had identified when she was 5 years old, the stillness that was not the absence of feeling, but the absolute presence of focus, a state in which the body and the mind and the rifle and the wind and the target existed in a single, unified system, and the act of pressing the trigger was not a decision, but a consequence, the inevitable result of all variables being aligned. She fired. The flight time was 1.38 seconds. She watched through the scope as the vapor trail curved left, then straightened, then descended. The round struck the DSHK gunner in the center of his chest. He fell backward off the sandbags, and the heavy machine gun's barrel tilted skyward, pointing at nothing. 15 down. DSHK neutralized. 33 rounds. The two remaining fighters at position 8 scrambled. One pulled the dead gunner aside and tried to reorient the DSHK. She fired again. The round hit the sandbag next to his hand, missing his body by centimeters. She cycled and fired again, this time center mass. He collapsed onto the gun. 16 down. 31 rounds. One miss. The third fighter at position 8 abandoned position entirely, running east along the ridge. She let him go. He was moving away from the valley, and pursuit was not her priority. Position 9 was the easternmost repair position, and from it, two fighters were pouring rifle fire into the valley at a rate that suggested they were either panicking or attempting to cover withdrawal. Distance, 1,120 meters. She engaged the first with a shot that required 6 minutes of windage correction and took 1.5 seconds to arrive. It struck him in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. He was wounded, not dead. She fired again. Dead. 17 down. 30 rounds. The second fighter at position 9 stopped firing. She watched him through the scope. He was young, perhaps 20, and he was staring at his dead companion with an expression that contained more confusion than fear. The look of a person for whom the idea of death had always been abstract and was now suddenly very specific. He set his rifle down. He put his hands on his head. He surrendered, though there was no one visible to surrender to. She did not fire. A target who had stopped fighting was not a target. He was a prisoner. She marked his position in her notebook and moved on. Position 9, one fighter surrendered. Not engaging. 29 rounds. The radio crackled. A voice she did not recognize at first, tight with something between exhaustion and disbelief. It was Briggs. Varga, how many shooters do we have on that ridge? I'm counting impacts from at least 3 different angles. Varga's response was quiet enough that Kira almost missed it through the static. 1. A silence followed that was different from the silences that had preceded it. This silence had weight. It had the particular density of a thing that could not be immediately processed by the mind that received it. Say again, Briggs said. 1 shooter. 1 rifle. She's been up there for 6 hours. The silence returned and stayed. Kira did not have time to appreciate it. The sweep team was closer now, for fighters moving along the ridgeline from the north, using the terrain with professional competence, leapfrogging between covered positions in 2-man pairs. They were 500 meters away and closing. They would reach her area in approximately 8 minutes. She had 29 rounds and 13 confirmed kills. The ridge positions were largely neutralized. The valley floor was still under fire from the mortar team on the reverse slope, but the direct fire from the ridge had been reduced to sporadic bursts from the one surviving fighter at position 6, and the occasional unaimed shot from positions she had already cleared, likely from wounded fighters making final gestures of resistance. The sweep team was the immediate threat, 4 men, trained, moving with purpose, looking for her. They did not know her exact position, but they knew her general area, and 4 trained fighters with knowledge of the terrain could cover ground quickly and systematically. She had 2 options: stay and fight from a fixed position, engaging them as they approached, or move to a new position that would give her an angle they were not expecting. She chose to move. Fixed positions against a hunting team were a losing proposition, because the hunting team's job was precisely to fix and flank a stationary shooter. Movement was risk, but stasis was death. She pulled back from the boulders and low-crawled east along the gully, dragging her rifle and her bandolier through the gravel. The cold had deepened, and she could feel in her core now a dull, heavy ache that made every movement cost more than it should. Her left hand was stiffening badly, the knuckles swelling with fluid that the cold was converting to something viscous that did not want to bend. She forced the fingers to flex, and the pain of it was bright and specific, like biting into ice. She reached a secondary position behind a low rock wall that gave her a view of the approach the sweep team would use. They would come along the ridgeline path, because the terrain below the path was too steep to traverse without climbing gear. The path was narrow, perhaps 2 meters wide, and it passed through a gap between two large boulders approximately 340 meters from her new position. They would come through that gap. She would be waiting. She settled the rifle on the rock wall and checked her scope. The magnification was set at 15x, appropriate for this shorter distance. She dialed her turrets. 340 meters required minimal elevation correction at this caliber, and the wind in this sheltered portion of the ridge was reduced to 6 knots. A straightforward engagement, if engagement with 4 armed men hunting you specifically could be called straightforward. The first pair of the sweep team appeared at the gap at 0714 hours. They moved well. The lead man scanning left while the trail man covered right, their rifles up and sweeping. She took the trail man first because the lead man was already past the gap and would need to turn 180 degrees to engage her, while the trail man was facing her general direction. Distance, 340 meters, nearly point blank by her standards. She fired. The trail man dropped. The lead man spun, tried to find cover, and expose his flank. She fired again. He went down. 18 and 19 down. Sweep team lead pair. 27 rounds. The second pair would have heard the shots. They would be taking cover, reassessing, possibly retreating. She waited. The scope was on the gap. 45 seconds passed. A minute. 90 seconds. At 2 minutes and 12 seconds, one of the remaining sweep team members made a mistake. He leaned around the right side of the boulder to observe the gap, exposing his head and shoulder for approximately 1 second. 1 second was more than enough. She fired. The round struck the boulder 8 centimeters below his position, fragmented, and sent rock splinters into his face and chest. He fell backward, wounded but not dead. His partner dragged him behind the boulder. 20 wounded. 26 rounds. One more in the sweep team. The final member of the sweep team did not show himself. He was behind the boulder with his wounded partner, and he was not going to make the mistake the others had made. She waited 5 minutes, then 10. The cold was becoming a serious factor now. Her fingers were losing fine motor control, and the tremor in her hands was back. Stronger, a rhythmic oscillation that made the crosshair dance in a small circle around a point of aim. She pressed her thumb into the pressure point on her wrist that her father had shown her, a trick from competitive shooting that temporarily restored hand stability through neurological reset. It worked. The tremor subsided, but it would return, and each time it returned, the reset would be less effective. She keyed the radio. Varga, Ren. Ridge is mostly clear. 19 confirmed, 1 wounded, 1 surrendered, 1 refusing to engage, and I can't get the mortar team on the reverse slope. I need you to send someone up the eastern trail to flank the mortar position. Copy, Ren. Sending Delgado with a fire team. ETA 15 minutes. I'll cover their approach. She shifted her scope back to the ridgeline, scanning for any remaining threats that might engage Delgado's team during their ascent. The ridge was quiet now, or mostly quiet. The sound of combat had diminished from a continuous roar to sporadic pops and the distant thud of mortars that were now falling less accurately, as though the mortar team had lost its forward observer and was firing from memory rather than direction. In the valley below, the ODA was regrouping. She could see Varga organizing the able-bodied men into a perimeter, and she could see the medic working on Chun, whose leg wound was being treated with a speed that suggested it was serious but not fatal. Briggs was at the western edge of the perimeter, his rifle pointed at the northern ridge, watching the position she had cleared with an expression she could not read at this distance but could imagine. Delgado's fire team reached the eastern trail at 0731 hours. Kira provided overwatch as they climbed, scanning the terrain ahead of their route for any sign of fighters repositioning to intercept them. The climb took 18 minutes, during which Kira engaged 1 more target, a fighter who emerged from a concealed position near the mortar team and attempted to reposition a second RPG. She hit him at 690 meters with a shot that required minimal correction, a clean engagement that she logged without emotion. 20 down. Position near mortar team. 25 rounds. At 0749 hours, Delgado's team reached the mortar position on the reverse slope. The engagement was brief, 8 seconds of concentrated fire that ended the mortar threat and produced 3 more casualties on the enemy side. Delgado's voice came over the radio, slightly breathless. Mortar position eliminated. 3 enemy Kia. We have documents and a satellite phone. Then a different voice, lower, with an authority that came from rank and from something else, from a specific gravity of man who had just understood the full scope of what had happened on this mountain. General Feld, who had been monitoring the tactical net from the FOB at Asadabad, spoke. Ren, this is Warhorse 6 Actual. What is your status? Ren is operational. 20 kills confirmed. 2 wounded enemy. 1 surrender. 2 still unaccounted for. I have 25 rounds remaining. A pause. And how many personnel are at your position, Ren? She looked at the empty rocks around her, at the brass casings lined up on the thermal blanket, like small copper soldiers, at her left hand where the knuckles were swollen, and the skin had the waxy appearance that preceded frostbite. She looked at the notebook in her chest pocket, the one with her father's handwriting on the first page, and she felt something move through her that was not triumph and not relief and not sadness, but something adjacent to all 3, something that had no name because it existed only in the space between what she had done and what it had cost. 1, she said. The descent began at 0812 hours, and it was worse than the ascent in every way that mattered. Going up a mountain in darkness with a full kit and a clear mind is a technical problem. Going down a mountain in daylight with stiffening hands and a body that has been prone on frozen rock for 6 hours while processing the neurochemical aftermath of killing 20 human beings is something else entirely. Kira's legs, which had been folded beneath her or extended behind her for the duration of the engagement, did not want to move in the manner that walking required. Her left knee, which had taken the full weight of every position change, produced a grinding sensation when bent past 40 degrees that suggested the cartilage had been compressed beyond its design tolerance. Her left hand was a problem she was choosing not to think about, because thinking about it would make the swelling and the stiffness into a narrative, and narratives invited fear, and fear was a luxury she could not currently afford. She moved down the eastern gully, using her rifle as a walking stick on the steeper sections, which was not a use the weapons designers had intended, but which the weapon tolerated without complaint. The route she had chosen avoided the ridgeline path where the sweep team's bodies lay and instead descended through a series of switchbacks that goat herders had worn into the rock over generations. The path was narrow, sometimes less than a foot wide, with drops on the left side that ranged from inconvenient to fatal depending on the section. She moved deliberately, placing each foot with the conscious attention of someone who understood that a fall here would be quiet and undiscovered, and would end everything she had accomplished in the last 6 hours. She was halfway down when the satellite phone, recovered from the mortar position, changed everything. Delgado's voice came over the radio at 0823 hours, and there was something in it that Kira had not heard before, a control fury that made each word land like something being set down very carefully to prevent it from breaking. Varga, you need to see what's on this phone. We have call logs, text messages, and GPS coordinates. There are messages in English from someone using the call sign Meridian. The messages contain ODA movement schedules, insertion times, and a specific reference to, quote, the female shooter's designated overwatch position, unquote. Someone in the task force has been running this compound as a contact point. The radio silence that followed was the longest of the day. Kira stopped walking. She stood on the goat path with the wind pushing against her back, and the valley spread below her like a diagram of everything that had gone wrong. And she felt the things she'd been carrying for 9 years, the things she had joined the Marine Corps to find, shift and settle into a shape she could finally see. It was not a surprise. Surprises come from the direction you are not watching. This came from the direction she had been watching since she was 17 years old, standing in her mother's kitchen, while a man in a uniform told her that her father was dead and that the details were under review. Meridian, she said aloud, and the word tasted like something old and bitter and finally identifiable. She keyed her radio to Varga's private channel. Colonel, Meridian is Croft. How do you know that? Because Croft is the only person in the task force who had access to both the ODA movement schedule and my designated overwatch position. The overwatch position was assigned in a briefing that included 4 people. You, me, Croft, and General Feld. Feld didn't know my name until 2 hours ago. You, and I are not Meridian. That leaves Croft. Varga did not respond for 8 seconds. Then he briefed the mission. He built the intelligence package. He diverted the satellite coverage. He downgraded the SIGINT intercepts. All of it designed to put the ODA into a prepared kill zone and to put me on a ridge position that the enemy already knew about. If I had gone to the designated position, I would be dead. The ambush wasn't just for the ODA. It was for me specifically. Croft didn't just sell our movement data. He sold my capability profile. He told them what I could do so they could plan for it. Why? Because someone is paying him, and whatever they're paying him requires that coalition operations in this valley fail. Zardin isn't just a target. He's an asset. Someone needs him alive and operational, and Croft has been ensuring that for months, maybe longer. She paused. The wind moved over her, and she felt the cold of it as something distant, a fact about the world that no longer concerned her because she was occupied with a fact about herself that was much larger. Colonel, I need to see Croft's communications history, not the official logs, his personal devices. There's a pattern here that goes back further than this mission. If his network is the same network that compromised my father's team in Fallujah in 2015, then Croft isn't a lone actor. He's a node. Falcone, you need to come down and get medical attention. Your hand. My hand will keep. Croft won't. If he realizes the satellite phone has been recovered, he will destroy his devices and disappear into whatever protection his handlers provide. We have a window. The window is closing. She resumed her descent with a purpose that overrode the pain in her knee and the swelling in her hand and the bone-deep exhaustion that was beginning to blur the edges of her vision. She moved faster now, almost recklessly, because the calculation had changed. The mountain was no longer the primary threat. The primary threat was a man in a plywood office at Asadabad who was, at this moment, either unaware that his communications had been compromised or actively implementing his contingency plan. She reached the valley floor at 0841 hours. The scene below was the aftermath of organized violence. The overturned Humvee, the cratered earth, the medics working on the wounded, the ODA personnel establishing a security perimeter with the exhausted efficiency of men who had survived something they were still processing. Sergeant Chun was on a stretcher, his leg wrapped in compression bandages, his face the color of old paper. Gutierrez was sitting against a rock with a tourniquet on his thigh, methodically cleaning his rifle with one hand, while the other held a canteen. Briggs was standing at the northern edge of the perimeter, looking up at the ridge she had just ascended, with an expression she could now see clearly. Not admiration, not resentment, but something more complex, the rearrangement of a worldview in real time. She walked past him without stopping. He said her name. Falcone. She stopped, turned, waited. 20 kills, he said, from a single position, in 6 hours. Multiple positions, she corrected. I moved 3 times. He nodded, slowly, as if the correction mattered, and also as if it didn't. I filed that complaint. The 8 signatures. I want you to know I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I know you did. It was wrong. She looked at him for a moment, and what she saw was not the man who had mocked her in the common area or moved her equipment or used the word experiment as though it were a diagnosis. She saw a man who was standing in the wreckage of his own certainty, trying to find his footing, and who had chosen to do so by stating a truth rather than constructing an excuse. It was not much, but it was something. Yes, she said. It was... She turned and walked toward Varga, who was standing near the command vehicle with Delgado, and a JAG lawyer she did not recognize, a captain with the exhausted posture of a man who had been woken at an hour when lawyers should not be needed. Varga saw her approaching, and his eyes went to her left hand, which was visibly swollen, and had taken on a color that was past pink and approaching purple. Falcone, that hand needs. The hand can wait. Where's Croft? At the FOB. He doesn't know about the phone yet. Then we go now. Right now. Before he finds out. Varga looked at Delgado. Delgado looked at the JAG lawyer. The JAG lawyer looked at Kira Falcone, a corporal with frostbitten fingers and 20 confirmed kills, an expression that contained no anger and no desperation, and no vengeance. Just a flat, calibrated attention of a person who had located a target and was preparing to engage. "We go now," Varga confirmed. The helicopter flight to the FOB at Asadabad took 14 minutes. Kira sat in the back with her rifle across her knees and her father's notebook in her right hand, and her damaged left hand wrapped in a chemical heat pack that Delgado had produced from somewhere in her kit with the quiet competence of a woman who had been fixing things for other people for so long that it had become reflexive. The notebook was open to a page near the back, past all the wind data and range calculations, to a section that Kira had written herself, not about shooting, but about something else. It was a list of names, dates, and fragment of information she had collected over 9 years, each entry a piece of a puzzle she had been assembling since the night her father died. At the bottom of the list, written in pencil because she had not been certain enough for ink, was a single entry. Intel Liaison, Satv. Possible connection to Comet Redirect, Fallujah, November 2015. Name unknown. She looked at the entry. Then she picked up a pen and wrote, in ink next to it, Croft Leland, Major, call sign Meridian. The puzzle was not complete, but the piece she had been missing for 9 years was now in her hand, and it fit. They landed at the FOB at 0903 hours. Varga, Delgado, Kira, and the JAG lawyer, Captain Gwynn, walked directly to the intelligence section. Major Leland Croft was at his desk, reviewing documents on a laptop with the composed demeanor of a man whose morning had been entirely routine. He looked up when they entered, and for a moment his expression remained professional, curious, the appropriate response of an intelligence officer receiving an unscheduled visit from field personnel. Then he saw Kira's face, not her injuries, not her filthy uniform or her swollen hand, or the frost residue on her ghillie suit. Her eyes, and whatever he saw in them told him everything the satellite phone would confirm. Leland, Kira said. She used his first name, not his rank, not his surname, not the professional distance of military protocol. His first name, spoken with the intimate precision of someone who had been looking for him for a very long time and had finally arrived. He did not run. He did not deny. He sat very still behind his desk, and something passed across his face that was not fear and not guilt, but something more like exhaustion. The particular tiredness of a man who had been carrying a secret that was too heavy for one person and who, on some level, was relieved to set it down. "You should have been at the designated position," he said quietly. "How did you survive?" "I moved, because I read your intelligence package and I saw what was missing, the same way my father would have seen it, if someone had given him the chance." The name landed. She saw it land. Croft's eyes changed, and she knew, with the certainty that comes from watching a target through a scope, that Croft knew what name she was about to say. "Thomas Falcone," she said. "Fallujah, November 2015. The Comet redirect that exposed his team's position. That was your network." Croft closed his eyes. "That was before me. I inherited the channel. I didn't build it. You inherited it, and you kept it running. For 14 months, according to the phone Delgado recovered from the mortar team. 14 months of selling position data, movement schedules, and capability assessments to a network that uses them to kill Americans and Allied personnel. It's more complicated than that." "No," Kira said. "It isn't." Captain Gwynn. The JAG lawyer stepped forward. "Major Croft, you are being detained under the Uniform Code of Military Justice on suspicion of espionage, unauthorized disclosure of classified information, and providing material support to a hostile force. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to military counsel." Croft listened to the rights with the distant attention of a man hearing weather forecasts for a city he no longer lived in. When Gwynn finished, Croft looked at Kira one last time. "You're Thomas's daughter. I should have known." "You did know," she said. "That's why you tried to put me where they could find me." Delgado and Varga took custody of Croft, while Gwynn secured the laptop and personal devices. Kira stood in the hallway outside the intelligence section, leaning against a wall that smelled like plywood and dust, and she realized that her hands were shaking. Not from the cold, not from the frostbite, from something that had been held in compression for 9 years and was now, slowly, beginning to decompress. She pressed her palms flat against the wall and breathed the way her father had taught her, for counts in, 7 counts hold, 8 counts out, and she waited for the shaking to stop. It took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. She counted. The formal investigation began 41 hours later at Bagram Airfield, in a conference room on the second floor of the Joint Operations Center that had been cleared of its usual occupants and swept for electronic surveillance. The room contained a long table, 12 chairs, a projector that no one used, and a quality of fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly ill, which was appropriate given the nature of what was being discussed. The investigating panel consisted of 5 officers. At the center was Brigadier General Marcus Feld, whose face had acquired a new set of lines since the Gamber Valley, and whose posture suggested a man who was simultaneously performing his duty and reckoning with the fact that his duty should have begun months earlier, when Varga first raised concerns about Croft's intelligence package. To Feld's left was Colonel Diana Shepard, the SOP staff judge advocate, a woman whose reputation for thoroughness had survived 23 years and 3 administrations without acquiring even a rumor of compromise. To Feld's right was Rear Admiral Philip Bryce, representing Naval Special Warfare Command, who had flown in from Bahrain specifically for this proceeding and who had said very little since arriving, but whose presence alone communicated the seriousness of the institution's attention. The remaining 2 seats were occupied by a CID investigator, whose name Kira was not given, and a civilian intelligence analyst from the Defense Intelligence Agency, whose name, she suspected, was not real. Kira sat at the far end of the table, in a chair that was identical to the others but felt smaller, the way chairs do when the person sitting in them is being evaluated by 5 people with stars and eagles and the authority to reshape a career with a signature. Her left hand was bandaged, the frostbite having been treated at the field hospital in a Satabad with a combination of rewarming therapy and anti-inflammatory medications that had reduced the swelling but not yet restored full function. She could grip a pen. She could not yet grip a rifle. The doctors had told her the prognosis was favorable, which in military medical parlance meant probably fine, but we are covering ourselves. Corporal Falcone, General Feld began, "This panel is convened to review the events of October 17th in the Gamber Valley, your role in those events, and the circumstances surrounding the detention of Major Leland Croft. This is not a tribunal. This is a fact-finding investigation. Your testimony is being recorded, and you may consult with counsel at any time. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "Please describe, in your own words and in as much detail as you can recall, the engagement on the northern ridge of the Gamber Valley, from the moment you arrived at your overwatch position to the moment you descended to the valley floor." Kira began speaking. She spoke for 2 hours and 14 minutes, without notes, without pausing to collect her thoughts, and without once saying approximately, or I think, or if I remember correctly. She described each shot with the precision of an engineer, describing the specifications of a machine, distances in meters, wind speeds in knots, elevation corrections in minutes of angle, flight times in fractions of seconds, and results in clinical terms that reduce the act of killing to its mechanical components, while never losing sight of the human reality beneath the mechanics. She described the ammunition count at each stage, starting at 48 and tracking it through every engagement to the 25 she had remaining at the conclusion. She described the wind patterns, the thermal behaviors, the mirage lines, the specific characteristics of the air at 2,800 meters that made every shot a negotiation between what the scope said and what the environment did. She described the sweep team, the position changes, the deterioration of her hands, the technique she used to temporarily restore fine motor control. She described the moment she identified the prepared fighting positions on the northern ridge, the rocks that had been moved, the color differential that revealed them. She described all of this in a voice that was steady and unadorned and that carried the weight of absolute certainty, because every word she spoke was drawn from a memory that had recorded the events with the fidelity of a system designed to operate in exactly these conditions. When she finished, the room was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the soundproofing. Colonel Shepard spoke first. "Corporal, you stated that you deviated from your designated overwatch position by 400 meters to the south. This deviation was not authorized by Colonel Varga or any other commanding officer. On what basis did you make that decision?" "On the basis that the designated position was compromised. The SIGINT intercepts I reviewed the night before the mission contained a specific reference to the female shooter's designated overwatch position. That reference could only have originated from within the task force. which meant the enemy knew where I was supposed to be. Going to that position would have been tactically equivalent to walking into a prepared ambush. And you did not report this assessment to Colonel Varga? I reported the SIGINT findings regarding the Northern Ridge defense. I did not report my suspicion about the compromised position because I did not have proof at that time, and reporting an unsubstantiated accusation of an intelligence leak 12 hours before a division-approved mission would have resulted in the accusation being investigated and the mission being delayed, during which time the target, Zardin, would have relocated and the mole, whoever it was, would have had time to sanitize their communications. So you made a unilateral decision to deviate from your assigned position based on your own analysis without informing your chain of command. Yes, ma'am. And that decision saved your life. Yes, ma'am. And, I believe, the lives of the 12 men in the valley, because if I had been at the designated position, I would have been the first casualty of the ambush, and the OGA would have had no Overwatch support during the engagement that followed. Shepard looked at Feld. Feld looked at the table. Admiral Bryce, who had been silent throughout Kira's testimony, leaned forward. Corporal Falcone, I have reviewed the satellite phone data, recovered from the mortar position, the call logs and message traffic attributed to the call sign Meridian, and the preliminary forensic analysis of Major Croft's personal devices. The evidence supports your account of a deliberate intelligence compromise originating from within the task force. I have also reviewed Colonel Varga's operational assessment. He held up a document. It was 17 pages, handwritten, on legal pad paper in Varga's blocky, deliberate script. This assessment contains a shot-by-shot reconstruction of your engagement on the Northern Ridge, including distances, environmental conditions, ballistic calculations, and timing intervals. Colonel Varga states that the level of performance documented in this engagement is, in his words, unprecedented in my experience and in the documented history of the program. He notes that you fired 24 aimed rounds, achieved 20 kills and 1 additional wounded, with 2 misses, over a period of approximately 2 hours, at distances ranging from 340 to 1,120 meters, in conditions that included altitude, extreme cold, crosswind, and active counter-sniper threat. Is there anything in that summary you would correct? The 2 misses, Kira said. The first miss was at 950 meters. The wind gusted at the moment of firing and pushed the round left. The second miss was at position 8, 1,060 meters. I aimed for center mass and hit the sandbag adjacent to the target. I corrected and hit the target on the follow-up shot. Both misses were wind-related. The first was a gust I didn't anticipate. The second was a misjudgment of the thermal shear at the valley boundary. You remember the specific cause of each miss. My father taught me to remember misses more carefully than hits. Hits confirm what you already know. Misses teach you what you don't. Admiral Bryce set down the document. He looked at her with an expression that she could not fully read, because it contained elements that did not usually appear together on the face of a flag officer. Respect, discomfort, and something that might have been recognition. The look of a man seeing something he had heard about but never believed existed until it was sitting in front of him in a chair at the end of a conference table with a bandaged hand and creek-water eyes. The matter of Major Croft, Feld said, moving the proceeding forward with the deliberate pace of a man who wanted every word on the record be exactly right. Captain Gwynn, please summarize the current status of the investigation. Captain Gwynn, the JAG lawyer from the FOB, stood. He had slept perhaps 4 hours in the last 2 days, and his uniform showed it, but his voice was clear and organized. Major Leland Croft has been formally charged under Articles 104 and 106A of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, specifically with aiding the enemy and espionage. Forensic analysis of his personal devices has revealed 14 months of communications with an intermediary using encrypted messaging applications. The communications include the sale of operational intelligence, force disposition data, personnel capability assessments, and satellite coverage schedules to a broker network that the DIA has linked to the Akani Network's operational planning cell. Financial records seized from Croft's quarters indicate payments totaling approximately $340,000 over 14 months, routed through 3 shell entities in Dubai, Karachi, and Tbilisi. Gwynn paused and looked at Kira. Corporal Falcone's specific capability assessment, including her marksmanship scores, her designated Overwatch position, and her psychological profile was transmitted to the broker network 9 days before the Gamber Valley operation. The enemy's preparation of fighting positions on the northern ridge, their knowledge of the ODA's insertion timeline, and their specific targeting of the designated Overwatch position were all directly enabled by Croft intelligence. And the connection to the Fallujah operation in 2015? Shepard asked. Gwen hesitated. The forensic trail is preliminary, but the communications channel Croft used, the same broker network, the same encrypted infrastructure, has been linked to at least 3 other compromise operations dating back to 2013. The DIA assessment, which I want to emphasize as preliminary, is that Croft did not create this channel. He inherited it from a predecessor, whose identity has not yet been confirmed. The Fallujah operation, in which Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Falcone was killed, is among the cases being reviewed for potential connection to this network. The room processed this information in the way that rooms process information that is simultaneously important and incomplete, with attention that was sharper than comfort and silence that was louder than speech. Admiral Bryce spoke. Corporal Falcone, I'm going to ask you something that is not strictly within the scope of this investigation, and you are free to decline to answer. Did you enter the Joint Special Operations Sniper Selection with the intention of gaining access to classified information related to your father's death? Kira looked at him. She had anticipated this question, had known it would come, had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, by deciding in advance what the truth was and committing to it without modification. Yes, sir, in part. The primary reason I pursued the qualification was because I am a sniper and I belong in this program. The secondary reason was that the clearance level associated with this program would give me access to files that I have been unable to access through any other channel. I did not compromise my training, my evaluations, or my commitment to the program in pursuit of that secondary objective. I earned my place on the Ridge. The Ridge is where I discovered that the objective I had been pursuing for 9 years was standing in a plywood office at the FOB. And now that you found it, now that Croft is in custody and the investigation is underway, now I want the investigation to be complete. Not for me, for the 63 personnel who were killed or wounded in operations that may have been compromised by this network, for their families, who received official explanations that may have been constructed to conceal institutional failure, and for my father, who went out on a mission that someone made sure would fail, and who deserved better from a uniform he wore. Bryce nodded. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. The investigation scope expanded over the next 72 hours in ways that no one in the conference room had fully anticipated. The DIA's preliminary assessment became a formal counterintelligence investigation that eventually spanned 4 countries and 13 military and intelligence agencies. The broker network that Croft had used was traced through financial records, communications metadata, and human intelligence to a structure that had been operating since 2011, selling coalition operational data to multiple insurgent groups across 3 theaters of conflict. The network had facilitated the compromise of at least 9 operations, resulting in the deaths of 63 coalition personnel and an unknown number of allied Afghan forces. 57 personnel requested to provide statements on Kira Falcone's behalf. 57. The number was entered into the record by Colonel Shepard, who read it aloud with the careful neutrality of a lawyer who understood that some numbers were also arguments. The statements came from ODA members who had been in the Valley, from training cadre at Camp Merrill, from Marines who had served with her in previous deployments, from intelligence analysts who had worked with her, and from Briggs, whose statement was 3 pages long and contained a sentence that was later quoted in the classified summary of the investigation. Corporal Falcone is the most capable operator I have encountered in my career. I oppose her inclusion in this program because I did not understand what I was looking at. I understand now. Varga's 17-page assessment was entered into the record as Exhibit 14. It contained not only the shot-by-shot reconstruction of the Gamber Valley engagement, but a comprehensive evaluation of Kira's performance throughout the selection course, including specific observations about her wind-reading methodology, her psychological stability under extreme stress, and her ability to operate independently in conditions that would have degraded the performance of most trained snipers by 50 to 70%. The final paragraph of the assessment read, In 22 years of Special Operations service, I have evaluated hundreds of operators across every branch of the military. Corporal Falcone is not the best female operator I have seen. She is the best operator I have seen. The distinction is important, because the qualifier diminishes the accomplishment, and the accomplishment does not deserve diminishment. General Feld rendered his findings on October 24th, 7 days after the Gamber Valley engagement. Croft was referred for general court-martial, where he would eventually plead guilty to espionage and be sentenced to 31 years in federal custody, a sentence that was later reduced to 22 years in exchange for his cooperation in identifying other members of the broker network. The reduction was necessary. It was also, in the opinion of everyone who had been in the Gamber Valley, insufficient. Kira received a formal reprimand for deviating from her assigned Overwatch position without authorization. The reprimand was entered into a record with the administrative weight and notation that everyone involved understood to be procedurally necessary and substantively meaningless. In the same session, she received a field promotion from corporal to sergeant, a Silver Star for gallantry in action, and a recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross, which was later approved and awarded in a classified ceremony at Joint Special Operations Command Headquarters. She also received something that no medal or promotion could provide, a letter from Colonel Shepard confirming that her father's case, the Fallujah operation of November 2015, had been formally reopened as part of the broader investigation into the broker network, and that a dedicated team of CID investigators had been assigned to determine whether Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Falcone's death was a result of compromised intelligence originating from the same channel that Croft had inherited. The letter was 1 page. Kira read it 4 times. Then she folded it and placed it in her father's Win notebook, between the page that recorded her first hit on the tin at 50 yards and the page that began the section on thermal behavior at altitude. The night after the findings were rendered, Kira sat alone in her quarters at Bagram. The quarters were a step up from the plywood cubicle at Sadabad, an actual room with an actual door and a cot that had a mattress rather than a canvas sling, luxuries that the military provides to people it is simultaneously reprimanding and promoting, which is a thing that only the military does, and which only makes sense within the specific logic of institutions that must enforce procedure while acknowledging reality. She sat on the cot with her rifle across her lap, not cleaning it, not checking it, just holding it. The rifle was her father's scope mounted on a stock that she had fitted herself, and it was, in a sense that went beyond the mechanical, the last collaborative project they had worked on together. He had bought the scope. She had built the platform. The combination of the two had performed exactly as designed, across 20 engagements at distances, and under conditions that exceeded anything either of them had tested in the mountains behind Oceanside. She thought about what she felt, because her father had also taught her that feelings, unexamined, become weight, and weight, unacknowledged, becomes paralysis. She examined what she felt the way she examined wind patterns, with attention and without judgment. What she felt was very quiet, not empty, not numb, not the suppressed aftermath of trauma that counselors would look for and that she would dutifully describe in the mandatory psychological evaluation that was already scheduled for next week. What she felt was a specific quiet that follows completion of a task that has organized your life for so long that its absence leaves a space shaped like purpose. For 9 years, she had been moving toward this point, toward the moment when the identity of the person who had compromised her father's mission would be known and the machinery of accountability would begin to turn. That moment had arrived. The machinery was turning, and she was sitting on a cot in a room that smelled like cleaning solution, holding a rifle, feeling something that was not satisfaction, and not grief and not relief, but was, if she was honest with herself, most accurately described as readiness. Not readiness for something specific, just readiness. The state of being prepared to act, without yet knowing what action would be required. She reached into her chest pocket and pulled out the laminated photograph. Her father, kneeling in desert camouflage, one hand on the rifle and one hand on her 8-year-old shoulder. Both of them looking at something the camera could not see. She had always assumed they were looking at a target. But sitting in this room, holding this photograph for the 1,000th time, but seeing it, perhaps, for the first time with eyes that had done what his eyes had done, she realized they might have been looking at something else. Not a target, a distance, the space between where they were and where the bullet would go. The space that contained all the variables, all the unknowns, all the things that physics could predict, but only patience could manage. I found him, she said to the photograph, not aloud in a way that people speak to the dead when they want to be heard, but aloud in the way that people speak when they need the words to exist in air rather than in thought, because air gives words a weight that thought does not. I found him, and he's in a room with a lock on the door, and the people who let him operate are being identified one at a time. It won't bring you back. I know that, but it means the truth about how you died will be in a file that someone can read, and it will be accurate, and it will have your name spelled correctly, and it will say that you were killed by a betrayal that you could not have seen coming because it came from behind you, from the place where betrayal lives when it lives inside the institution you trusted. She held the photograph for another minute, then she placed it back in her pocket, but differently than she had placed it before. Before, she had always pressed it against a notebook, layered beneath the data, as though it needed protection of his written words. This time, she placed it in front of the notebook, facing outward, visible through the pocket's translucent liner. A small change, a change that no one would ever notice. But the placement meant something to her that she did not yet have words for, something about the relationship between evidence and memory, between what can be documented and what can only be carried. There was a knock on the door. She said enter, and Varga came in, holding 2 cups of coffee that were clearly from the mess hall and clearly terrible, a gesture that echoed their first conversation in equipment shed at Camp Merrill and that carried, in its repetition, the warmth of shared reference. He handed her a cup. He sat on the single chair. He did not speak for perhaps 30 seconds, during which they both drank coffee that neither of them enjoyed and both of them needed. "How's the hand?" he asked. She flexed her left fingers. The bandage restricted movement, but beneath it, the swelling had receded enough that she could feel the individual knuckles again, which was progress. "It'll heal. The doctors say full function in 3 to 4 weeks. Maybe 6 for competitive grip strength. And the rest of you?" She considered the question. It was not about her hand. "I thought it would feel different. Finding out who was behind it. I thought there would be a moment of, I don't know, closure. That's the word people use. But what I feel is that a door closed and another one opened, and behind the new door is more work." Varga nodded. "That's what it actually feels like. Closure is a word for people who watch from the outside. The people who do the work never feel it. They just feel the next thing they need to do. Colonel, I want you to know something. On the ridge, when things were worst, when the sweep team was coming and my hands were failing, I thought about quitting for about 4 seconds. Then I heard my father's voice. Not a memory, not a quote, just the sound of it. The sound of someone who expected me to continue. And I continued. That's not quitting, Falcone. For seconds of wanting to stop, and then not stopping, is the entire definition of endurance. She almost smiled. Almost. He would have liked you. I would have liked him. Vargas stood. He set his cup on a chair. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of saying something important, which was to say nothing at all and to let the silence carry it. Then he extended his hand. She took it with her right hand, her grip firm, her eyes steady. "Whatever comes next," he said, "you've already done the thing that matters. You told the truth, and you backed it up with evidence. And you did both of those things while people were trying to kill you. Everything after this is footnotes." He left. Kira sat alone with her coffee and her rifle in the quiet, and she felt something shift, not dramatically, not with cathartic release that stories promise, but gradually, like the rotation of a compass needle finding north. The shift was this. For 9 years, she had been the daughter of a dead man, organized around his absence, driven by his unfinished story. She was still his daughter. She would always be his daughter. But the story was no longer unfinished. It was continuing, and she was the one continuing it, and the direction it pointed was forward, into a future that contained more work and more questions and more mornings at the range before dawn. And that was enough. Not everything. Enough. She picked up the rifle. She began to clean it. The motions were automatic, practice. The same sequence she had performed 10,000 times since she was a girl on a ranch in Oceanside with bolt action .22, and a father who wrote good in a notebook when she wanted to try again after missing 43 times. The cleaning took 12 minutes. When she finished, the rifle was ready, and so was she. 8 months later, Sergeant Kira Falcone stood in front of the classroom at the Joint Special Operations Sniper School, which had relocated its advanced altitude and environmental marksmanship curriculum to a new facility in the mountains of Colorado, because the woman who designed the curriculum had insisted that altitude training required actual altitude, a position so obvious that it had taken the institution 6 months and 4 committee meetings to approve. The classroom held 23 students, 4 of whom were women. The gender composition was not remarkable to anyone in the room, which was itself the most remarkable thing about it. The students were Rangers, Green Berets, SEALs, and Marine Raiders, each one selected for the advanced course on the basis of qualification scores that did not include a field for gender and did not need to. Kira stood at the front with a dry erase marker in her hand and her father's Win notebook on the lectern, open to the first page. She had debated whether to show them the notebook. It was private, deeply so, a document that contained not just data, but the entire architecture of a relationship between a father and a daughter that had been conducted to the language of ballistics and patience. But she had decided that the notebook's value was not in its privacy, but in its instruction, and that her father, who had written it for her, would have wanted the instruction to continue past the boundaries of their family. "This course," she said, "is going to teach you things that are not in any manual currently published by any branch of the military. We're going to talk about wind at altitude, about thermal behavior in mountain terrain, about the specific challenges of engaging targets at extreme distance in conditions that the standard ballistic tables do not account for. We're going to talk about cold, about what it does to your hands and your weapon and your judgment, and about the techniques that allow you to perform precise work when your body is telling you to stop. And we're going to talk about waiting, because in the mountains, the waiting is where the work lives. The shot is 1 second. The waiting is everything else. And if you cannot master the everything else, the 1 second will fail you." She tapped the notebook. "This was written by my father, Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Falcone, who spent 12 years recording wind patterns, thermal behaviors, and environmental variables across 67 terrain profiles. He wrote it by hand, in the field, based on direct observation. Every entry in this notebook was tested by firing real rounds at real distances in real conditions. There is no theory in these pages that has not been confirmed by brass on the ground. This notebook is the foundation of the curriculum you are about to begin. My father did not write it for publication. He wrote it for me. I am now writing it for you." She turned to a whiteboard and wrote a single sentence. "The rifle does not know who is holding it. It only knows physics. That was his first lesson," she said, "and it will be mine. The physics works if the inputs are correct. Your job for the next 12 weeks is to learn how to make the inputs correct when everything around you is trying to make them wrong. The wind, the cold, the altitude, the enemy, and your own fear. All of them are noise. Your job is signal." She set down the marker. The students picked up their notebooks. The room filled with the sound of pens on paper, a sound that carried across the quiet morning like a small, precise promise. Outside the classroom windows, the Colorado mountains stood against a sky that was a particular shade of blue that exists only at altitude, a blue so deep it was nearly violet. The color of distance made visible. Kira glanced at them once, briefly, the way a person glances at something familiar and essential, like the face of someone they love. The investigation into the broker network had, by that point, resulted in an indictment of 11 individuals across 4 countries. The reopened cases included 7 operations in which coalition personnel had been killed or wounded under circumstances that were now understood to have been compromised by internal intelligence breaches. Her father's case was among them. The investigation was ongoing. It would continue for years. But the trajectory was established, and the truth, which had been buried under classification stamps and procedural delays for nearly a decade, was moving toward the surface with a slow, irreversible momentum of something that could no longer be contained. Kira's curriculum produced results that the institution could measure and could not ignore. Her first class graduated with a pass rate of 91%, compared to the program average of 64%. Her students deployed to 11 countries in the following year, and the after-action reports from those deployments contain a recurring observation that the operators trained in Falcone's altitude and wind methodology performed at a level of accuracy in mountain environments that exceeded the baseline by a factor that ranged from 30 to 45%, depending on conditions. The methodology was adopted, first as a supplement and then as a core component, by 3 branches of the military. The notebook, her father's notebook, was digitized and classified and distributed to training facilities at 5 installations. And while the classification prevented the public from knowing its origin, everyone in the special operations community knew whose handwriting was on the first page and whose daughter had turned a handwriting into a doctrine. She taught every session herself for the first year. She was offered a position at the Pentagon twice and declined both times. She was offered a book deal through a literary agent who had somehow acquired her name and her email address despite the classification of her service record. She declined that too, with a response that was 3 sentences long and contained no explanation beyond the statement that the work is not finished. She was offered a transfer to a unit whose name she was not permitted to repeat and whose mission she was not permitted to describe. She declined that as well, because the classroom was where she needed to be, because every student who walked out of that classroom with her father's lessons in their notebook and her methodology in their muscle memory was a continuation of something that Thomas Falcone had started on a porch in Oceanside with a 5-year-old girl and a .22 rifle and the patient belief that stillness could be protected and talent could be built, and the hard thing could be done if you were willing to miss 40 3 times and come back on the 44th day. One morning, before her class arrived, she stood at the window of the empty classroom and looked at the mountains. The wind was coming from the northwest at approximately 8 knots, with a secondary thermal current beginning to build off the south-facing rock faces as the morning sun hit them. Ghost hands, her father had called them. You can't see them, but they're pushing. She opened the notebook to the first page and read the entry she had read 10,000 times. October 14th. Wind from east for not steady. Kira fired 20 rounds at tin can, 30 yards. Hit 0. She wants to go again tomorrow. Good. She closed the notebook. She set it on the lectern. She straightened her uniform, checked the whiteboard, and arranged the chairs. Then she stood in front of the room and waited for her students to arrive, the way her father had waited for her every morning on the range, with patience that was not the absence of urgency, but the refusal to let urgency replace readiness. The students filed in. They took their seats. 23 faces, some of them nervous, some of them confident, all of them carrying particular tension of people who know they are about to learn something that will change what they are capable of. Kira looked at them. She did not smile, because this was not a moment for smiling. But something moved behind her eyes that a careful observer might have recognized. Something warm and steady and durable. The expression of a woman who had walked out of a valley and off a mountain and through an investigation and into a classroom, and who had arrived not at an ending but at a beginning. Good morning, she said. Welcome to the mountains. Let's get to work.